On the brisk autumn evening, when the crimson and gold leaves began to surrender to the winds sweeping down from the mountains, the city of Bremerius stood in uneasy calm. The capital had always been a symbol of prosperity, but if one looked closer, if one truly listened to the hush settling over the markets and the hushed conversations behind shuttered windows, one would sense something more ominous stirring in the air. An undercurrent of dread, like a low hum beneath a musical chord, had begun to vibrate through the cobblestone streets. King Darius III, the ruler of the House of Rathmore, felt this dread keenly as he dined alone in the great hall of the royal palace. Though tapestries depicting his ancestors' valorous deeds hung from the walls, though the grand marble columns soared high into a ceiling painted with images of heavenward battles and crowning glories, the king could not shake the sensation that he was presiding over the final chapter of his family's storied reign. The crown, a circlet of gold set with a single enormous ruby at its center, felt heavier each day. The once resplendent hall, lined with courtiers and sycophants in better times, was now empty save for a few loyal knights who stood guard by the main doors. King Darius stared at his plate of roasted pheasant, bread, and dried fruit, his appetite lost to a festering anxiety. That day, he had received a sealed letter marked with the sigil of the Iron Bank, that infamous and legendary institution known for its impartial dealings and an uncompromising stance on debts. The letter had been succinct. It had demanded immediate repayment of the crown's substantial loan within 30 days, or else. King Darius had seen the threat couched behind the polite language. He knew of the Iron Bank's fearsome reputation, how they had quietly backed pretenders and rebels in distant lands when the rightful ruler failed to honor his obligations. He knew, too, that the crown's coffers were perilously low, for the realm had just emerged from an expensive campaign beyond the eastern mountains. The kingdom's resources were further depleted by years of mismanagement and lavish expenditures by Darius's father, whose ambition had been to forge a grand empire even if it meant borrowing vast sums. Still, Darius had tried to calm himself. He reminded himself that he was the king of Rathmore, that his house had endured for 3 centuries, and that an institution, no matter how powerful, was not a living, breathing thing. Could be reasoned with. Some arrangement might be made. The Iron Bank was known for its cunning negotiations, but they usually offered terms before demanding a kingdom's ruin. Or so he told himself. That line of thinking was the only solace he could cling to while he mused over potential solutions. Maybe new taxes on trade, maybe forced tributes from lesser lords, maybe the sale of some worthless provinces. He found no plan that felt truly sufficient. Night fell, and King Darius remained alone in his chamber, poring over scrolls of the royal treasury. By candlelight, he scribbled figures, wrote notes in the margins, and rubbed his temples. His attempts to find a solvency path only demonstrated the severity of the kingdom's financial plight. The monstrous debt was real, and there was no quick fix. With a trembling sigh, he pressed his royal signet ring against the melted wax of his letter, intending to request another extension from the Iron Bank. He had scarcely sealed it before dawn peeked through the tall windows, gilding the tapestries in muted gold. 3 days later, an emissary from the Iron Bank arrived unannounced at the palace gates. His name was Loren Tyvale, a slim, graying man with a face like chiseled ice. Word traveled quickly through the palace staff that he was no ordinary messenger. He was a high-level representative empowered to make or break deals. He appeared at court dressed in dark silks, the symbol of the Iron Bank, a simple iron coin, pinned to his breast. King Darius, clad in a ceremonial robe lined with fur, received Loren in the throne room, where once the chamber would be filled with courtiers, minstrels, and a vibrant display of aristocratic life. There were now only a dozen or so carefully chosen nobles. The hush was palpable. Loren stepped forward, bowed with practiced precision, and waited to be acknowledged. "Welcome," said the king, attempting to sound reassuring. "We received your letter. I trust we can come to an understanding." Loren's bow was polite but not obsequious. His thin lips curved slightly. "Your Grace, the Iron Bank seeks only what was promised. We would prefer an amicable solution as well." Darius gestured to a seat that had been arranged for the emissary. Lauren sat, though his posture was so upright he might as well have been standing. The king cleared his throat. He introduced his master of coin, Sir Edric Vale, a portly knight more adept with ledgers than swords, hoping the man's numbers could paint a gentler picture. Sir Edric dipped his head at Lauren, then fanned out the ledger pages, each one detailing recent expenditures and the difficulties the crown faced in recouping finances quickly. The expression on Lauren's face hardened inch by inch. Everyone in that throne room could sense the man's patience thinning. Politely but firmly, Lauren set down the ledgers and looked the king in the eye. The Iron Bank appreciates your full disclosure, but the principal plus interest remains due in 30 days. Should the crown find itself incapable of repayment, we will have no choice but to seize assets held in trust with us and take further action. I strongly advise you, Your Grace, to uncover the funds. Without raising his voice, he made it clear the bank would not be merciful. His measured, calm demeanor was more terrifying than any shouted ultimatum. Before leaving, Lauren inclined his head one more time. The bank awaits your decision, and we trust in the House of Rathmore's sense of honor and obligation. With that, he strode out of the throne room, leaving the king, his master of coin, and the gathered nobles in a state of brittle silence. No one dared speak until the echo of Lauren's footsteps vanished. Over the next few weeks, the palace became a hive of frantic activity. Couriers were dispatched to every corner of the kingdom, carrying royal mandates for increased tariffs, surcharges on local lords, and sales of certain valuables from the royal treasury. The paintings of old kings, the gilded suits of armor, the extravagant tapestries. Some of them were sold to distant collectors or wealthy merchant families. Even the sacred rubies that once adorned the queen's crown found their way to merchant vessels headed north, to be sold at auctions in foreign cities. Yet the sums gained were but droplets in the vast ocean of debt. Simultaneously, the king's counselors met daily in a chamber adjoining the throne room, brainstorming desperate measures. They discussed the possibility of launching a new trade mission to distant realms, the expansion of silver mines in the southwestern hills, or even the forced subjugation of a smaller neighboring state to extract tribute. The king could hardly believe the suggestions being tossed around. They reeked of desperation and risked plunging the kingdom into deeper chaos. Worse, with each passing day, the Iron Bank's envoy hovered like a silent specter in Bermerius, presumably monitoring the crown's efforts. Anxiety and paranoia spread through the streets. Merchants inflated their prices, trying to line their pockets before disaster struck. Peasants withheld their harvest from the royal granaries, fearing they might never be paid for their goods. The city guard, noticing the tension, became more heavy-handed in policing. Fights broke out in taverns and on street corners. People spoke in hushed tones about how the House of Rathmore might be on the verge of collapse, how the Iron Bank had toppled mightier dynasties elsewhere, how the city might soon see the arrival of a foreign-backed claimant to the throne. Surely enough, rumors began swirling about an exiled noble, a distant relative of the Rathmore line who had long been believed dead. His name was Lord Aidan Meridox, an upstart with a questionable claim to the throne. Some whispered that he had engaged in negotiations with the Iron Bank, offering them more favorable terms in exchange for their financial support should he press his claim. None of these rumors had been confirmed, yet they persisted, coursing through the city's underbelly and eventually reaching the ears of King Darius himself. Where there was smoke, there was usually fire, and the king's sleepless nights grew even more tormented at the notion that a new pretender might soon emerge. The deadline approached like a storm cloud. Tensions rose between the crown and its vassals. For decades, the House of Rathmore had commanded loyalty, but loyalty could ebb as quickly as the tides when fortunes were at stake. A handful of nobles balked at the king's new levies, claiming that the realm's debt was not their personal burden. The seeds of rebellion were sown. To preserve a veneer of order, King Darius called for a grand feast and festival, hoping to show unity and celebrate the kingdom's resilience. But everyone who attended could feel the charade. At that banquet, gold and silver chalices clinked as if mocking them, and the strained smiles of the lords and ladies did little to hide their apprehension. Finally, on the 30th day since the Iron Bank's demand, Loren Tyrvale made his way back to the palace. Darius and his advisors awaited him with an enormous coffer standing in the throne room. They had gathered a substantial sum, sizable enough to impress any onlooker, but they knew it was not the full amount owed. Darius hoped the partial payment would secure an extension. He explained how his realm needed only a bit more time, pledging the southwestern silver mines as collateral. As Sir Edric Vale fumbled through a prepared statement, Loren listened with that same impassive demeanor, occasionally tapping his finger on the polished armrest of his seat. "We are aware, Your Grace, of your efforts and your sincerity," Loren said, once the king finished speaking. "The Iron Bank acknowledges this partial repayment. However, it falls short of what is owed. The time for negotiation has passed. We will proceed with the measures outlined in our contract." He snapped his fingers, and a procession of armored guards bearing the sigil of the Iron Bank, an iron coin set against a dark field, entered the throne room. They were no more than a dozen men, but their presence was enough to suck the oxygen from the chamber. Two of them stepped forward, carefully took possession of the coffer of gold, and accompanied Loren as he rose. King Darius's voice wavered, but he kept it steady enough. "What do you mean to do?" he asked. Loren studied the king for a moment, then gave a slight bow, more of courtesy than respect. "We have invoked our right to seize any crown assets held in trust. Henceforth, accounts in the Iron Bank under the name of House Rathmore are frozen. Ships bearing the royal crest at certain foreign ports may be claimed. And, of course, the bank reserves the right to support alternative claimants to ensure repayment. This is the path you have left us, Your Grace." With that, Loren and his retinue turned and left. No swords were drawn in the throne room that day, but the kingdom's fate seemed to hang on a knife's edge all the same. Darius glanced over at his assembled nobles, searching their eyes for loyalty, but he found only shock and fear reflecting back at him. In that moment, he felt the intangible weight of centuries pressing down upon him, the burdens of past kings who had taken loans from the Iron Bank with little foresight. That evening, the palace corridors bustled with frantic whispers. The news spread like wildfire. The Iron Bank had begun to seize ships belonging to the royal fleet anchored in neutral harbors. They had placed a hold on all future trade deals the crown tried to broker outside the realm. Foreign investors, once dazzled by the prestige of House Rathmore, now turned away or demanded exorbitant interest rates to even consider business with the crown. Worse still, smaller lords within the kingdom saw the writing on the wall. Some began withholding taxes, concluding that the crown's authority might be temporary. In the countryside, roving bands of deserters and mercenaries sensed the realm's vulnerability and wreaked havoc on trade caravans. The roads became unsafe. The hearts of the people grew uncertain. Within days, further calamities struck. The royal mint, already running low on bullion, could not produce new currency without devaluing existing coinage. This triggered a spike in inflation. The commoners groaned under the weight of rising prices, and soon bred riots erupted in the poorest quarters of Brimirius. The city guard, undermanned and demoralized, struggled to contain the chaos. News of the kingdom's financial ruin overshadowed every piece of local gossip. Merchants stopped accepting the crown's newly minted coins. Street hawkers took to bartering instead of trusting currency. King Darius, ensconced in his palace, could hear the tumult. Every morning he would awaken to more grim tidings. Another riot, another band of merchants leaving the kingdom for better prospects elsewhere. Desperate to stem the bleeding, the king summoned his vassals to an emergency council. Haggard from lack of sleep and weighed down by the knowledge of his kingdom's plight, Darius pleaded for unity. But as he looked out at the assembled faces, earls, counts, barons, he noticed how some avoided eye contact. He saw how others shifted uncomfortably, as though not fully certain they wished to remain loyal. When Sir Edric Vale announced that the Iron Bank's blockade of crown assets left them unable to pay the standing army on time, murmurs of alarm reverberated across the hall. Soldiers fought for coin, after all. If they were not compensated, they might desert or turn traitor. With every word, the precarious state of the monarchy became clearer. Just as these grim realities settled in, a herald burst into the council chamber, breathless. He knelt and presented a parchment with a broken seal. It bore a sigil unknown to many in the room, but not to King Darius. It was the crest of House Meriadocs, that exiled branch of the Rathmore bloodline, rumored to be in exile across the sea. The herald's voice trembled. He read the proclamation. Lord Aidan Meriadocs, rightful claimant to the throne, declared King Darius unfit to rule, citing his incompetence in managing the realm's finances and well-being. Lord Aidan called for all loyal knights to rally under his banner, promising to restore prosperity. Underwritten, of course, by certain powerful financial institutions abroad. The paper did not explicitly mention the Iron Bank, but the subtext was clear as day. The wolves were at the door. In the courtyard outside, thunder boomed overhead, and rain began to pelt the palace roofs. It was as if the heavens mourned with King Darius. Standing at the dais, holding the parchment in both hands, the king felt an overwhelming sense of doom. After the herald had finished, none of the nobles said a word. The flickering torchlight showed their faces twisted with anxiety. Some even displayed hints of relief, as though a clearer path to stability had suddenly been revealed to them, albeit under a different ruler. At length, the king spoke, his voice steadied by sheer force of will. "We must stand against these false claims. I will not see our kingdom torn apart by an exiled opportunist. My father and grandfather fought to preserve House Rathmore's sovereignty. He tried to rouse some spirit in the crowd, invoking tradition and duty. A few of the vassals nodded, but many still wore that uncertain expression. Meanwhile, deep in the city's winding streets, new rumors took hold. Whispers of caravans loaded with gold and supplies heading north to a hidden encampment. Stories of how the Iron Bank had already lent Lord Aidan a staggering sum to outfit a respectable army of mercenaries. If the Iron Bank was indeed supporting Lord Aidan, it meant the Pretender's forces would be well-provisioned and swift in movement. Almost overnight, the kingdom found itself facing an existential threat from within, financed by one of the most relentless institutions in existence. From the vantage point of the common folk, the monarchy now seemed like a sinking ship. Many fled Brimirius, seeking refuge in smaller towns or along the coasts. Others begrudgingly swore loyalty to Lord Aidan, believing he might restore order and prosperity if he took the throne. Scattered pockets of loyalists to King Darius tried to maintain faith in the crown, but their voices were overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of the crisis. Soon, sightings of Lord Aidan's forces were reported in the outer provinces. With funding to hire mercenaries, the Pretender had assembled a formidable army, boasting a cadre of cavalry, halberdiers, and archers. They seized small fortresses along the kingdom's borders without significant resistance, as local lords weighed the grim reality of the crown's finances and simply opened their gates. Where Aidan went, he paid for supplies in gold minted by the Iron Bank, a currency no merchant dared refuse. His promise to pay soldiers regularly and in hard coin made him an attractive choice for knights looking to fight on the winning side. With each minor victory, Aidan sent missives proclaiming the liberation of the realm from financial tyranny, casting King Darius as a failure who had led the kingdom into penury. In Brimirius, King Darius prepared for the worst. He recalled his loyal soldiers from distant outposts, leaving some border regions undefended. The battered remains of the royal treasury were spent on equipping a defense force in the capital. Armorsmiths and weaponsmiths worked day and night, forging swords, spears, and armor for any man willing to fight for the king. Archers were stationed on the city walls. Watchtowers were manned around the clock. Yet morale was precarious. Soldiers openly wondered if they would see any coin for their service. They prayed for victory, hoping the spoils of war might fill their empty pockets. All the while, the Iron Bank's shadow loomed. Merchants, spurred on by the bank's influence, refused to extend credit to the crown. Even the local guilds that once provided the monarchy with grain, steel, or horses demanded immediate cash payments at inflated rates. The stench of betrayal filled the capital. Darius found it harder and harder to trust anyone. His court grew ever quieter as courtiers either fled or kept a low profile, sensing that the downfall of House Rathmore might be imminent. Eventually, reports reached Bremirius that Lord Aedan and his army were encamped just 15 leagues away. They had crossed the Midland River with surprising ease, bridging it with timbers purchased from local sawmills. Panic seized the city. Some families packed up everything they had and left by night, traveling to safer regions or foreign lands. The city gates were closed to prevent mass exodus, but that only led to resentment among the citizens trapped inside. Riotous crowds gathered outside the palace gates, demanding answers, demanding bread, demanding a solution to the chaos enveloping the kingdom. King Darius stood on a balcony overlooking the palace courtyard, where the city guard tried to keep the throng at bay. The sight nearly broke him. He saw mothers clutching hungry children, old men shaking their fists in desperation, tradespeople who only wanted a stable environment to sell their wares. They all okayed to him with anger or pleading in their eyes. Raising a hand, Darius tried to speak. His voice, amplified by the stone walls, echoed out. He promised that the crown would restore order, that these were only temporary hardships. But his words sounded hollow even to himself. How could he promise such things when the Iron Bank had cut off his lifeline, when a rival marched with an army upon his doorstep? In the royal stables, a black stallion named Ember was saddled for the king. The best knights of the crown, including Sir Barristan Storm, a tall, broad-chested warrior famed for his loyalty, stood ready to ride out. If it came to open battle, King Darius intended to lead from the front, to prove he was not some cowardly figurehead. Perhaps he hoped that valor in the field might rally what was left of his supporters. Or perhaps he simply had nothing left to lose, convinced that a final stand against Lord Aedan's forces was the only destiny left to him. Before dawn the next day, the clang of metal echoed through the courtyard as the king's forces assembled. Horns blew, waking the city with a somber dirge. The soldiers carried banners bearing the golden falcon of House Rathmore, though the edges of those banners were frayed, a physical testament to the kingdom's decline. Sir Edric Vale, though not a warrior, stood at the palace gates with tears in his eyes, trembling from a mixture of fear and devotion. He handed the king a small ring that had once belonged to Darius's father, a final token of House Rathmore's pride. Darius put on his helm and gazed at his assembled men. Hardly more than 3,000 soldiers in total, a fraction of what a prosperous monarchy could field. Their faces were grim, their armaments mismatched, but there was a glimmer of determination in some of their eyes, a sense that if they failed here, the realm would pass into the hands of a usurper financed by an institution that cared not for tradition or lineage, only for profit. They marched out under the gloom of overcast skies. The farmland around Bremirius, once lush and bursting with life, lay stunted by an unseasonable chill. The soldiers trudged across muddy roads, passing farmsteads whose occupants peered from behind shuttered windows. There were no cheers, no flowers strewn in their path. The people watched in silence, uncertain which side would deliver them from this crisis. By noon, King Darius's scouts reported that Lord Aedan's army was encamped in a broad valley flanked by gentle hills. The king consulted with his generals, trying to find any advantage. The land offered little in the way of a strong defensive position, nor were there easily forded rivers to separate them from the enemy. The hillside might provide a vantage for archers, but Aedan's force was large enough to flank them. Yet Darius had no better options. To wait in the capital for a siege would invite disaster. The city was too restless, and supplies were short. If he was to face the Iron Bank's chosen champion, best to do it in open ground. Thus, they marched onto the field that same afternoon. Rain threatened, but only scattered droplets fell, creating a slick top layer of mud. As Darius's army arrayed itself, they saw the scale of what they faced. Lord Aedan's battalions numbered well over 6,000, bolstered by mercenaries from foreign lands, easily identified by their distinct armor and the banners of their companies. Cavalry sat in disciplined rows, the horses' breath steaming in the cool air. On the far side, King Darius could make out the figure of Aedan himself, astride a chestnut mare. He wore gleaming armor adorned with a crest that fused the Rathmore falcon with a stylized crown, an overt statement of his claim. A hush settled over the valley. Two armies, one battered by insolvency and fraying loyalty, the other newly galvanized by foreign gold, stared each other down. In that tense moment, King Darius guided Ember forward. He raised his visor and called out, "Aiden Meridox, by what right do you challenge the throne?" A rider peeled away from Aiden's ranks. Dressed in fine garments beneath a slim cuirass, he carried a small wooden chest on his lap. He halted a short distance before Darius and opened the chest, revealing it to contain bars of silver, each marked with the sigil of the Iron Bank. "Behold," the rider said, voice raised for all to hear, "the endorsement of the Iron Bank. They have deemed you unfit, for you have failed to pay what is owed. Lord Aiden Meridox offers them a rightful partnership, ensuring the stability of the realm. Relinquish your crown, or we will take it by force." The gall of it left Darius momentarily speechless. He felt anger and shame burn in his chest. Could the Iron Bank so openly finance his downfall? Indeed, it appeared so. Some of his soldiers, hearing those words, shifted uncomfortably. The mention of the Iron Bank sent a ripple of trepidation through Darius's lines. At last, the king found his voice. "The realm is not a ledger to be balanced in blood and coin alone," he shouted. But even he could sense how frail his conviction sounded. With that, the parley ended. The rider closed the chest, spun his horse around, and galloped back to Aiden's side. Trumpets blared, a rallying cry for the usurper's forces. Archers stepped forward, drew their bows, and loosed the first volley of arrows into the air. The sky darkened briefly with the feathered shafts as Darius's men raised shields, bracing for the impact. Screams and the ring of steel exploded across the valley. It had begun. Though outnumbered, the king's men fought with a desperation born of survival. On the flanks, Sir Barristan Storm led a cavalry charge that crashed into Aiden's mercenary pikemen. Mud and blood churned beneath pounding hooves. Spears splintered against shields. The king himself fought at the center, sword glinting in the weak sunlight. He cut down several attackers, determined to show that House Rathmore still had might. Yet for every enemy he felled, two more seemed to take their place. The gold fueling Aiden's war chest had afforded him archers of deadly skill and engineers who brought small catapults, lobbing crude firebombs into the king's ranks. Over the din of battle, Darius could hear the roar of men and horses, the clash of swords, the wet thunk of arrows finding flesh. The stench of burning pitch and iron assaulted the senses. Somewhere to his left, a horn blew, signaling his archers to retreat up the hill as Aiden's cavalry flanked them. Desperate to reclaim the momentum, Sir Barristan led another fierce charge. But Aiden's lines held fast, their morale bolstered by their knowledge that the Iron Bank stood behind them with inexhaustible resources. Even among the mercenaries, the promise of additional pay if they routed the king's army spurred them on. As the afternoon wore on, the battle turned more and more against King Darius. Men fell in droves. Shouts of agony and curses filled the air. The king's standard-bearer was struck by an arrow through the throat, toppling into the mud. The golden falcon banner, now stained with blood, sank low. When the standard fell, an uneasy dread spread among the king's ranks. The lines began to buckle. Amid the chaos, Darius spotted Lord Aiden, whose armor still shone, unsullied by mud or gore, calmly directing the mercenaries. Aiden carried an ornate longsword with a pommel shaped like the falcon of House Rathmore, as though claiming the very symbol of the family heritage. Enraged, Darius spurred Ember forward, cutting a path through the melee. He spied an opening as Aiden's guard shifted to deal with an incoming assault on their flank. Darius engaged Aiden directly, his sword colliding with the usurpers in a burst of sparks. Steel rang out. Aiden proved surprisingly skillful. He blocked and riposted with a fluid grace, forcing Darius to shift his footing in the muddy ground. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire battlefield held its breath, warriors on both sides stepping back to see this fateful duel. Darius hammered blow after blow, but he was fatigued, his arms already numb from the hours of combat. Aiden, in contrast, appeared fresh, the strength of his cause and the advantage of rest fueling each strike. Blades locked, The two claimants glared at each other, faces inches apart. Through gritted teeth, Darius spat, "You sold our kingdom to the bankers. How can you call yourself its rightful king?" Aiden's lips curled into a smirk. "I do what I must to restore order. You have squandered everything." With a swift motion, Aiden disengaged and slashed at Darius's thigh. The king gasped, staggering as warm blood trickled down his leg. He tried to swing again, but Aiden parried and countered with a thrust to Darius's side. The king's armor held, but the blow knocked him off balance. He fell to one knee in the mud, pain flaring up his body. Aiden stood over him, sword raised. Before he could deliver the final blow, Sir Barristan, having witnessed the king's peril, charged in on horseback. His lance struck Aiden's shoulder, sending the usurper reeling. He lost grip of his sword for an instant. Seizing the opportunity, Darius mustered the last of his strength to lunge forward, hacking at Aiden's unprotected thigh. The wound was shallow but enough to draw blood. Aiden hissed in pain and staggered back. The momentary advantage allowed Darius to rise, though his leg throbbed, threatening to give out. Barristan wheeled his horse around, trying to keep Aiden's knights at bay. For a heartbeat, it looked as though the king's defiance might prolong the battle. But fortune soon shifted again. A volley of arrows, aimed at the king and his retainers, came whistling through the air. Barristan managed to raise his shield, but the sheer number of arrows was overwhelming. One pierced the gap in his armor below his armpit. Another lodged in his thigh. With a wrenching groan, the faithful knight toppled from the saddle. An arrow caught Darius's left arm, piercing through chainmail. He cried out in agony. Seeing their king wounded and their once glorious cavalry in disarray, many of Darius's soldiers lost heart and began to retreat. Some surrendered on the spot, hoping for mercy. Others simply ran. The battered loyalists were either captured or cut down in their flight. Only a small pocket of knights remained, forming a desperate shield wall around their wounded king. Aiden's men pressed in from all sides, and the battlefield became a ring of steel closing around House Rathmer's final stand. Darius fought on, half delirious from pain and exhaustion, his sword movements slowing. He caught glimpses of horror around him. Men lying in blood-soaked mud, severed limbs, horses screaming. He could sense that the day was lost. Still, he clung to a defiance that refused to let him yield. The name of Rathmore would not end without a final breath of resistance. Aiden, wounded but buoyed by victory, barked an order for his archers to hold. He wanted the king taken alive if possible. The usurper dismounted his horse, wincing from his leg wound, and strode through the carnage. With the sun dipping low, the sky burned orange, lending a lurid glow to the devastated field. Mud caked Aiden's boots, and blood spattered his once gleaming armor. Behind him, the Iron Bank's mercenaries roved to collect weapons, armor, and any spoils of war. It was a grim harvest, funded by the unstoppable tide of silver. At last, Aiden stood before Darius, who was propped up by two loyal knights, each supporting an arm. The king's helm had been torn away, revealing matted hair and a face streaked with mud and blood. Arrows jutted from his armor, and he barely clutched his sword in trembling hands. Yet he stared at Aiden with unwavering hatred. "Your reign is done," Aiden declared, breathing heavily. "Yield, and your life might yet be spared. The realm will be better without you." For a moment, King Darius said nothing, chest heaving. Then, in a final show of defiance, he spat at Aiden's feet. "You'll never be king," he rasped. "The Iron Bank pulls your strings." Aiden's expression flickered with anger. He nodded to one of his men. The knight stepped forward, raising a heavy iron gauntlet, and struck Darius on the temple. The battered king slipped into unconsciousness. His sword fell from his grasp, clattering in the mud. Thus ended the final battle for the throne. A single day's carnage that effectively sealed the fate of House Rathmore. By the next sunrise, Lord Aiden Meridox entered Brimirius unchallenged. The city gates opened, whether by fear or resignation, and the new claimant to the throne made a triumphant procession through streets lined with sullen onlookers. At Aidan's side rode none other than Loren Tyvale of the Iron Bank, his face as impassive as ever, a living symbol of the bank's approval. Soldiers hoisted banners that combined the crest of House Rathmore with Meridox's modifications. Trumpets blared a hollow fanfare in the dawn light. Within days, Aidan was crowned. The ceremony took place in the great hall where Darius had once dined alone. Now, the cavernous space was filled with lords who had either pledged their loyalty or were too frightened to do otherwise. The new king, wearing the golden circlet with the ruby at its center, pried from the battered brow of a dethroned Darius, held court with a stern composure. Priests anointed him, proclaiming him the rightful king. But the real power in that room was visible in the dark corner, where Loren and a small retinue of the Iron Bank stood watch, ensuring that their new investment did not stray from their interests. The Iron Bank wasted no time securing the realm's finances. Under King Aidan, they reinstated trade routes, lifted the freeze on credit for merchants who acknowledged the new regime, and funneled funds into critical infrastructure to stabilize the economy. Their methods were not gentle. Taxes were collected with ruthless efficiency, and rebellious lords found their assets seized or heavily penalized. But the effect on the capital was undeniable. Slowly, bread returned to the markets, taverns reopened, caravans brought fresh goods from afar, and the city's heartbeat steadied. A superficial sense of prosperity began to bloom again, overshadowing the memory of House Rathmore's downfall. As for King Darius, he was confined to a fortress tower overlooking the sea. Rumors whispered that he was kept alive to serve as a bargaining chip, or simply as a testament to the Iron Bank's ability to bring even the mightiest kings to heel. Some claimed he died of his wounds weeks after the battle. Others said he languished for years, haunted by the ruin of his house. No official decree announced his death, leaving the populace to speculate. Over the following months, life in the kingdom took on a strange new normalcy. King Aidan implemented policies carefully orchestrated by the Iron Bank's advisors. Debts were meticulously repaid according to a schedule that ensured the bank's profit. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens felt a mixture of relief and unease. They could buy bread, find work, and live without the immediate threat of riots or invasions. Yet an underlying resentment simmered. Whose kingdom was this now? Did Aidan truly reign, or did the Iron Bank? Among the noble houses, some quietly seethed at the new order. They had given in out of fear, yet they recognized how precarious their autonomy had become. Whenever they questioned a policy, an emissary from the bank would remind them of outstanding debts, or point out how easily their lands could be forfeited if they opposed the crown. The bank's shadow extended into every corner of governance, from the treasury to the royal council, from trade tariffs to military funding. King Aidan tried to portray himself as the great unifier, traveling to outlying regions to mend fences with disenchanted lords, even offering tax incentives to those who pledged unwavering loyalty. He performed public acts of benevolence, distributing alms to the poor or paying for repairs to temples. In official proclamations, he lauded the Iron Bank as a steadfast partner in the kingdom's resurgence. But in private moments, he struggled with the knowledge that without the bank's gold, his throne would be built on sand. In hushed corners of taverns, bards sang songs of fallen House Rathmore. They told tales of how the Iron Bank, relentless and cold, had engineered the downfall of a once proud lineage. Some romanticized King Darius as a tragic figure undone by forces beyond his control. Others scoffed, attributing the collapse to the folly of living beyond the realm's means. Either way, House Rathmore's legacy was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among the devout and the embittered. Still, the kingdom did recover. Commerce thrived under the new administration. Roads that had fallen into disrepair were fixed, and the Iron Bank financed the dredging of a major river, boosting trade along its banks. The peasants began to see more coins in circulation, and artisans found new markets for their crafts. For many, the memory of war and poverty receded. Few dared wonder aloud how long the Iron Bank's generosity would last, or what the final cost might be. In the lofty towers of the palace, King Aidan occasionally gazed upon the old portraits of House Rathmore. They had not all been stripped away. Some historical pieces still remained, perhaps retained by the Iron Banks designed to show continuity. Aiden would study the painted eyes of past kings, feeling both triumph and a pang of guilt. He had seized the crown, but at what price? He sensed the presence of Lauren Tyvale more keenly than ever, that silent sentinel of the Iron Bank who reported directly back to Bravos, or wherever the Iron Bank's seat of power truly lay. The scribes of the royal treasury recorded every coin spent, every revenue gained, ensuring that the realm's obligations to the bank were met to the last copper. When Lauren appeared at court, always unannounced, King Aiden would greet him politely, offering a seat at his side. Lauren would convey subtle suggestions for new policies, sometimes encouraging a trade concession with another state, sometimes hinting at expansion into profitable silver mining territories. Aiden found it harder and harder to distinguish between his own will and the bank's guidance. At times, he yearned to push back, to assert his authority, but he remembered too well how easily the bank had destroyed Darius. He recognized that the same fate could befall him if he strayed from their approval. Meanwhile, pockets of resistance emerged across the kingdom. Former Rathmore loyalists, knights who had fled the battlefield and bandits who despised foreign interference, conducted sporadic raids on tax collectors and caravans. They painted the falcon of House Rathmore on trees to mark their defiance, and rumors circulated that a nephew of Darius had survived the slaughter and might someday press a new claim. Aiden's forces hunted these rebels ruthlessly. The Iron Bank was not pleased with any disruption to commerce or tax revenue. The new king had no choice but to comply in quelling the resistance, further fueling the narrative that he served at the bank's beck and call. Each time a rebel group was cornered and exterminated, the survivors told stories of how the bank had orchestrated the ruin of an entire dynasty. Far from extinguishing dissent, these brutal crackdowns only made martyrs of the rebels, giving birth to new legends of defiance. For every cell destroyed, 2 more seemed to emerge in distant hamlets or forest hideouts. A growing undercurrent of rebellion whispered through the kingdom, promising that eventually, the Iron Bank could not buy the soul of an entire people. Months led into years. King Aiden grew older, seasoned by the trials of managing a kingdom tethered to an almighty creditor. The Iron Bank, satisfied with regular payments and seeing stability maintained, shifted to a more background role. Lauren Tyvale visited less frequently. Trade agreements flourished. Taxes were collected on time, if at a high rate, to ensure the bank's share was never in jeopardy. Sprawling caravans once more traversed the major roads, and Brimirius bustled with renewed energy. Residents hailed the new era, an era of commerce, opportunity, and seeming prosperity. Yet in the hearts of many, a quiet question lingered. Was the kingdom truly free, or was it a vassal to the Iron Bank's influence? The question rarely found voice, but it slumbered beneath the surface. Lords who once resisted the new order had seen their fortunes restored, but their pride remained tarnished. They gritted their teeth at the knowledge that a bank, not a storied lineage, not an anointed king, ultimately held the lifeblood of the realm. And so life continued, balanced precariously between the new throne and the invisible hand that financed it. In the Great Hall, where King Darius once wrestled with the monarchy's ledgers by candlelight, King Aiden now presided over feasts celebrating bountiful harvests. The courtiers laughed and drank, raising toasts to the new prosperity. Bards composed verses praising Aiden's wise leadership. Yet in the deeper corners of the hall, one might still find an old tapestry depicting House Rathmore's falcon, overlooked or half-hidden behind more contemporary displays. Its threads had faded, its edges frayed, but it bore silent witness. To those who studied it, it was a potent reminder of how swiftly a house, even one that reigned for centuries, could be dismantled when faced with the Iron Bank's inexorable claim. Time would tell if Aiden's line could retain the throne once the debt was eventually repaid, or if another would rise to supplant him at the bank's behest, continuing the cycle of power traded for coin. For in that kingdom, and perhaps in many others, the Iron Bank stood eternal and unyielding. Gold was a mightier sword than most realized, and no crown, no matter how ancient or revered, was safe when the ledgers demanded otherwise. The story of House Rathmer's downfall would echo through the ages, a cautionary tale for any ruler who believed that debt was a trifling matter or that a deal with the Iron Bank ever truly ended. On the day King Aidan first felt mortal pangs of age upon his brow, seeing a hint of gray in his hair reflected in a polished mirror, he realized that he, too, was just another chapter in the kingdom's story. One day, that story would move on, and some new power might hold the puppet strings. The cycle of gold and throne would repeat, weaving an endless tapestry of ambition, betrayal, and compromise. So ended the reign of House Rathmore, and so began another fragile epoch, birthed by coin, blood, and the cold determination of the Iron Bank. And through it all, the memory lingered of what might have been if a king had ruled without the bank's noose, if ancient debts had never been incurred, if the realm had not drowned under the tide of a cunning creditor's unstoppable demands. The question would remain unanswered, overshadowed by the undeniable truth that gold, in the end, was the currency that ruled them all.